So let's now move to chapter 3 of Frowe's book, The Ethics of War and Peace. And in chapter 3, she turns to what are the conditions of jus ad bellum. now, jus justice in this jus ad bellum is the overall justice for war. So it's sort of like the overall justice of the war, like the overall case for it. So think of that as sort of the wide notion of justice here. But notice, it's the conditions of this wide justice for war. The conditions of jus ad bellum, the wide overall justice, has 7 parts. So these 7 conditions also includes the question of the justice of the war in terms of just cause. So this is like your narrow justice. And you can think of it in this sense. We often in everyday life will distinguish between, whether it's a good idea to engage in some kind of conflict. And then you make judgments and you sort of parcel it out. You say something like, well, maybe I've been slighted or wronged. And so, yeah, it's kind of legitimate for me to strike back or to say something. But is it still a good idea? And that reflection after receiving a slight and thinking you have kind of like a just cause in this narrow sense, but yet you still ask yourself, is it wise to go ahead? You're thinking of it in the wider sense now. So this distinction between the wider sense of should I engage and the narrow sense of, I was slighted, so, I kind of have a case to strike back over it. That distinction of wider and narrow justice, we use this in everyday. Like, is it a good idea to go and is it pick your battles? That common expression is very much what the just war tradition in producing these conditions has produced. And think of it this way, it also makes going and engaging in battle more complex and subject to many more conditions and many more judgments. So it's also a way to prevent war. It's also a way to tone it down by making people and nations less likely to engage in it. So the just war tradition, again, has settled on 7 conditions. So let's just go through them. Just cause, which is our narrow one, and we'll look at the paradigmatic case in a second. Proportionality, we've talked about proportionality in a previous video. And there's 2 kinds of proportionality that are going to come up. In this case, the proportionality in jus ad bellum is sometimes called the wide proportionality. We'll see the narrower proportionality when it comes to like battlefield actions and tactics, but that's not jus ad bellum, that jus in bello. So that's in a later video. So stay tuned for that, where we have the notion of a narrow proportionality. In this one, we're talking about the wide proportionality. It's a little confusing because we got narrow and wide and all that stuff going on here, but what can I do? You just kind of have to learn how the terminology works. The third one is the reasonable chance of success. And don't we do that in everyday life? Like, you may say to a friend, well, yeah, you're going to, engage or something with that person over there, or, something at work or whatever. But, what chance do you have? When you start talking like that, that's what you're doing. You're looking at, is it worth your while to get into that fight? Reasonable chance of success, right? Number 4, with legitimate authority, like, wars just don't break out over anything. Wars are usually the province of, traditionally we're the province of kings and queens and royalty and knights and barons, and then eventually governments. So the tradition is that, if you really have a war, it is declared by a legitimate authority. That if it's going to be a just war, that is. If it's going to be a just war, it has to be waged with the right intention. And we'll look at what exactly that means. But basically, if you're going into war, you're going into it for your intentions are reflecting the just cause and not something else. So you're not trying to pass a war off for a certain cause, but you really have a hidden intention, which might not be exactly that respectable. Another thing, you may say to a friend, well, okay, you kind of have a just cause in this narrow sense, and you might have it might have a reasonable chance of winning and all that, but, maybe you should try talking before you really launch a rocket. right? We often say that to people, like you should, take it easy, before you get into it. Why don't you just try and think if there's a way that's a little less, less, violent or nasty or whatever than really engaging in conflict. You're talking about a last resort kind of thinking. And of course, that's the same thing. Do you have options, right? We talked about options earlier in another video when you're considering, being attacked, and you discuss all that proportionality. But then we talk about options. Well, is it necessary? What's necessary? What can you get away with? What's the least violent thing you can get away with? War should always be your last resort, says the tradition. And then, as we talked a little bit about, it has to be declared by a legitimate authority, and it has to be made public, right? We're announcing that hostilities have broken out and war has been declared. And this goes way back. The Romans, had a whole elaborate way of declaring war before actually launching the troops. So these things you might be thinking, boy, this kind of has sort of a legal kind of a feel. True, it was connected. It was also connected a lot with theology. And so you got political philosophy, theology, legal, all kinds of stuff are in this kind of mixed bag that the just war tradition has bequeathed to us. Okay, so let's go back. I'll talk a little bit more of the other ones in a later video. But just for the remainder of this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about just cause. So that's your narrow justice, so to speak. And the paradigmatic just cause is, from our tradition, has basically been a war of self-defense. So that's why it was helpful, as Frowe did, to lead into the discussion of war and ethics and war and peace and all that stuff by talking about self-defense, because paradigmatically, a just war was really one of self-defense. That is a war of self-defense to repel a violation of sovereignty. So a nation or a state, the paradigmatic just war that it can enter into is when it says it's trying to repel a violation or a threat, a major threat to its sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is a tricky concept because it's been around a long time, and it's been, and as a concept, it has a long history and has changes of meaning over the years. Even now, people are starting to talk about, well, is sovereignty porous, and what does it really mean to be a sovereign nation when you're all in these big trading blocs and military alliances, and do you, like, for instance, is my country Canada, is it really sovereign in our day and age the way it was, let's say, prior to World War II? And the argument would be, no, it's not. It's not sovereign in that way anymore. I'm not going to say whether or not it's more or less or better or worse, whatever. But sovereignty as a concept has a history. So it's always important to think about concepts as themselves entities that have histories over time. And what does that mean? Well, they basically change their meaning or modify, taking on new meanings, dropping. Words change all the time. You can clearly look that up in the Oxford English Dictionary and look how a word has been used over time. Sovereignty is like that. As a concept of word, it's changed over time. And it's changing right now because people, again, are re-examining this concept in a lot of ways. But for the purposes of our discussions, think of it kind of like this. Sovereignty is largely about the notion of power. And a supreme power in a region or a territory. So there seems to be this kind of connection between the notion of a supreme power in a territory, basically that, and that supreme power's kind of job is to be in a community, and it might be a king or a government or whatever, but it's the highest level. There's nothing higher, right? That's why we have Supreme Courts. You appeal to that one, and once that court makes that judgment, it's supreme. It doesn't necessarily mean it's absolutely right or whatever, but there's nothing above it. It's a Supreme Court. And so this notion of sovereignty was the supreme power, and it had a job. And its job in a community was to protect that community's way of life. And so what the paradigmatic just war is when a community's sovereign, right, its power is threatened and violated, and it can no longer maintain or protect that community's way of life. So it's a way of life that's being threatened. This can happen in a lot of ways, right? So it's not necessarily the case that there's only one way to threaten sovereignty. There's a variety of ways. Traditionally, it's largely been over territory when one state tries to invade another and take something from it. And that's usually been regarded as more or less kind of a paradigm notion of the just war, is when somebody's stealing your stuff, right? But what it really underlines is not so much the idea of just taking stuff, but is that by stealing a state's property or its land or something like that, you're basically violating its sovereignty. You're making it more difficult for that supreme power to function in its protections of the community's way of life. So but again, this can be quite difficult to unpack. Does and of course, are there violations of degrees, and how would that work? A lot of just war theorists will disagree. Some just war theorists will say, kind of like Walzer, that, well, if you've got sovereignty, it's linked to a people and territory, and any incursion into that is grounds for declaring, this is an aggressor, this is an aggressive war, our sovereignty has been violated, we have a war to counter aggression, and off we go, we've got a just war in our hands. Some just war theorists are going to say, well, no, there's we can think of degrees of violation, and then you'll have some threshold. So, moral of the story is, even though we're starting to lay out the concepts here, there's going to be disagreements about what exactly these concepts mean. And then, of course, how they're instantiated, right? So when is something really an act of aggression and when it isn't? And of course, this is now changing because other, this sort of war to counter aggression was a paradigmatic just cause, and that's a judgment from history, but other reasons are becoming paradigmatic, like, humanitarian intervention, sorry. So this is broadening. So in other words, you have a look at Frowe's chapter 4. I'll get to that in a later video. But that's why she has the plural, not just war, but just wars with a question mark. Because, are there a variety of paradigmatic just causes now? And so you could have a variety of just wars, where it's not just simply just war, jus ad bellum, these 7 conditions, and the just cause really is always, a violation of sovereignty. And then you're looking at a particular case of conflict and asking, well, has there been a violation of sovereignty? No, you could be looking at conflicts and asking all kinds of questions, like, would there be other kinds of things, like not just a violation of sovereignty, but humanitarian intervention? There is violations of human rights? And then if you start saying, well, yeah, you can wage a just war over human rights, well, then you're going to have to change the notion of sovereignty, because you might be going into a sovereign nation and then invading it to stop that sovereign nation from committing human rights violations. Well, then you're not respecting the sovereignty anymore. You're having a different definition. You're sovereign provided you don't commit atrocities. Well, that's a different understanding of sovereignty than, let's say, from Westphalia of several hundred years ago, where kings and princes kind of said, you do what you do in your state and I won't bug you, and I do what I do and you don't bug me. That's a sort of an implicit notion of sovereignty as, like, master in one's own house. That's again changed over the years. So what do we even mean by a supreme power and whatnot? That is that is not up for grabs, but it is up for a debate. So there's paradigmatic unjust causes as well, like just sheer territorial expansion, right, is not a just recognized in any way as a just cause, but as an unjust one, same thing, like trying to expand your territory, trying to take natural resources from other states, and or another one was trying to change other governments that you don't like. So, but now that, of course, is coming under question. So again, this notion of a supreme power and what it really means and what kind of rights it has, they used to be, almost complete. It had absolute right. It could do what it wanted. It was the supreme power. Now we're starting to question that. So history gives us one thing, but history marches on and it gives us new things as we go along. Okay, so that's at least now we're getting sort of more of an idea. We've got the idea of the broad and then the narrow, but each of these are individually necessary. They have to be met, but just because one of them is met doesn't mean it's sufficient to say we have a just war. So they're jointly sufficient. So individually necessary, and once you got them all jointly together, then it's sufficient to say you have a just war on your hands. All right, see you next video.